Did Grandma find out we're doing Thanksgiving here now? I heard my granddaughter say it before anyone noticed me standing in the hallway. I stopped walking. The pie dish felt heavier in my hands. For a moment, nobody saw me. My granddaughter was setting silverware on the dining table. Sarah was arranging vegetables on the kitchen island. My son Michael was carrying folding chairs from the garage. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like family. Then Sarah answered, "Not yet." She laughed softly. "We were going to tell her tonight." The room laughed with her. Not cruelly, not meanly, just naturally. I stood there for another second. Then I walked into the kitchen. The conversation stopped. Sarah smiled immediately. "Dorothy, you're early." Michael kissed my cheek. "Good to see you, Mom." I set the pie dish on the counter. My granddaughter hugged me. Nobody looked guilty. That was the strange part. Nobody seemed to think anything was wrong. I looked at Sarah. "Doing Thanksgiving where?" There was a brief silence. Then Sarah answered, "Here." I waited. Nobody said anything else. Finally, Michael spoke. "We thought it would be easier this year." "Easier for who?" Sarah smiled. "For everyone," Michael nodded. "Less work for you." I looked around the room. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had called me. Nobody had mentioned it. The decision had already been made. I forced a smile. I didn't realize Thanksgiving was being moved. Sarah touched my arm. "We didn't want you worrying about all that." All that. Cooking, hosting, planning. The things I had done every Thanksgiving for more than 30 years. My husband built our dining room table in 1989. Every Thanksgiving happened around that table. Even after he died. Even after the children moved away. Even after the grandchildren became teenagers. The family always came back. At least I thought they did. Michael sat down beside me. "Mom, it'll be nice. You can just relax." Just relax. That phrase followed me home that night. I thought they had only moved Thanksgiving. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, small things started happening. Small enough to dismiss, small enough to ignore, small enough to hurt. A few days later, Sarah created a new family group chat. Everyone was included. Children, grandchildren, in-laws, everybody. The group was busy every day. Holiday plans, school events, birthday ideas, travel schedules, family news. I noticed something strange. Things appeared in the group after decisions were already made. Not before, after. One afternoon, I suggested a restaurant for my grandson's birthday. Sarah replied almost immediately, "We already booked somewhere." A few people added thumbs up emojis. The conversation moved on. Nobody asked which restaurant I had in mind. A week later, my granddaughter had a school concert. I called her after lunch. "What time does it start, sweetheart?" There was a pause. Then she said something I would hear many times later. "Didn't Sarah tell you?" "No." "Oh." Another pause. "I thought everyone knew." Everyone. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table staring at my coffee. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was starting to notice a pattern. The family was still sharing information, just not with me first. The following Sunday, I drove to Michael's house. The grandchildren were baking cookies. I smiled when I saw the recipe cards. The cinnamon cookie recipe had belonged to my mother, then to me. Now my granddaughter was holding it. Sarah stood beside her, showing her measurements, explaining temperatures, helping her shape the dough. "Grandma taught me this recipe," my granddaughter said proudly. I smiled. "Actually, my mother taught it to me first." The children laughed. The moment passed. Nobody did anything wrong. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For years, holiday recipes came through me. Questions came to me. Traditions came through me. Now they seemed to move through Sarah, not because she wanted to replace me, because everyone had simply gotten used to it. The next thing happened at a restaurant. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now I remember every second. Michael had taken me to lunch. Sarah came too. The restaurant was crowded. The waiter approached our table. He smiled politely. "Would you like coffee with your meal?" I opened my mouth. Sarah answered first. "No caffeine this late." The waiter nodded. "Of course." Then he walked away. The entire exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds. Nobody reacted. Nobody noticed. The conversation continued. I sat there quietly, thinking about the fact that nobody had actually asked me. Not the waiter, not Sarah, not Michael. The decision had simply been made. For me. A week later, Michael called. "Mom, can I stop by after work?" Of course. He arrived carrying groceries, milk, soup, fruit, a few frozen meals. I thanked him. Then he opened my refrigerator. He started rearranging things, throwing away expired items, moving containers around, checking dates. At first, I appreciated it. Then he opened a cabinet. Then another. Then another. I watched him move through my kitchen, comfortable, confident, like someone maintaining property. Finally, I laughed. "You know I've been feeding myself for 57 years. He smiled. "I know." Then he said something that stayed with me. "We just want to make things easier." Easier. Again. Everything seemed to be getting easier. Easier Thanksgiving, easier planning, easier schedules, easier decisions, easier responsibilities. One afternoon, I had my annual doctor's appointment. I arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist greeted me. I signed my paperwork. Then she asked a simple question. Should we update Sarah as well? I looked up. Update her about what? Any medication changes. I stared at her. She looked confused. We have her listed here. My stomach tightened. Listed where? As a family contact. I sat down slowly. The waiting room suddenly felt very quiet. Nobody had mentioned this. Nobody had asked. Nobody had explained. When I got home, I called Michael. He sounded surprised. "You didn't know?" "No." There was a pause. Then he said something that bothered me more than anything else. "I thought Sarah told you." The same sentence. Again. People kept assuming I knew things. I never did, because the conversations were happening somewhere else, without me. The following weekend, the family gathered again. This time for my grandson's birthday. Sarah stood in the kitchen organizing everything: food, decorations, cake, gifts, schedules. People naturally asked her questions. Not me, not Michael, Sarah. What time are we eating? Sarah knows. Where should we put this? Asked Sarah. Who is bringing drinks? Sarah handled that. I stood there holding a stack of paper plates, watching, listening, realizing something uncomfortable. Nobody had appointed Sarah. Nobody had voted. Nobody had discussed it. The family had simply adapted. And somehow I had become less necessary. Then came the moment I couldn't stop thinking about. My grandson was talking about an upcoming school trip. I offered a suggestion. Before he could answer, Michael smiled. Mom gets mixed up with dates sometimes. Everyone laughed lightly, even me, for a second. Then the room moved on. But I didn't. Because I hadn't mixed up the date. Not that day. Not that conversation. Not that moment. Yet nobody corrected it. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even looked surprised. The comment fit too comfortably. As I drove home that evening, one thought stayed with me. It wasn't Thanksgiving anymore. It wasn't the recipes. It wasn't the group chat. It wasn't even Sarah. It was the growing feeling that my family had started making room for a future where I wasn't the one making decisions anymore, and I was beginning to wonder how much of that future had already been planned without me. After that conversation about Thanksgiving, I started noticing something else. The decisions weren't just happening without me. They were starting to happen for me. At first, it seemed harmless, almost thoughtful. A few days after the family dinner, Sarah called. Dorothy, what time is your doctor's appointment next Tuesday? I looked at the calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. 10 o'clock. Perfect. Perfect for what? There was a pause. Oh, Michael is free that morning. I frowned. Why does that matter? So he can go with you. I laughed softly. I've been seeing this doctor for 15 years. I know. Her voice stayed calm. We just thought it might help. Help. Everything seemed to come back to help. I thanked her and ended the call. A few minutes later, I found myself staring at the calendar. Nobody had asked whether I wanted company. They had moved directly to planning it. The following week, Michael showed up at my house 20 minutes before the appointment. Dad used to hate being early. I smiled. Your father also hated being late? Michael laughed. Then he held up his car keys. I'll drive. I looked at him. Why? Parking is terrible there. I've parked there for 15 years. I know. There was that phrase again. I know. Everyone knew. Everyone understood. Everyone had already decided. I drove anyway, but the conversation stayed with me. 3 days later, Sarah sent me a text. A weather warning. Heavy rain was expected Friday night. 5 minutes later, Michael called. Mom, don't drive after dark Friday. I leaned back in my chair. Why? The roads will be bad. I've driven in rain before. I know. Another pause. It's safer this way. Safer. That word felt different. It wasn't about helping anymore. It was about deciding. I didn't argue, but I didn't like how quickly the conversation ended. The decision had already been made. I was simply expected to agree. The next authority shift happened at church. I arrived a few minutes before service. My friend Carol waved me over. We sat together. Halfway through the conversation, she smiled. It was nice of Sarah to organize your ride. I blinked. My ride? Carol nodded. For next week's luncheon. I stared at her. I wasn't aware I needed a ride. Her smile faded. Oh, the silence that followed felt awkward. Neither of us knew what to say. Later that afternoon, I called Sarah. She sounded cheerful. I was going to tell you. That sentence again. I was going to tell you. Not. I was going to ask you. Not. I wanted your opinion. Not. What would you like? Just. I was going to tell you. The luncheon wasn't important. The ride wasn't important. The fact that someone had arranged part of my life without me was. That night I sat alone in my living room, looking around the house, the same house where Michael grew up, the same house where I raised 2 children, the same house where every family holiday had started. For years, people came to me with questions. Now they arrived with solutions. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One Saturday afternoon, the grandchildren came over. We were looking through old photo albums. My grandson pointed to a picture. It showed me standing beside a station wagon. I was 36. The children were little. I smiled. I drove that thing everywhere. Before I could say anything else, my granddaughter laughed. Grandma, Sarah says you hate driving now. I looked up. What? She shrugged. She said that's why everyone's helping. I smiled politely. Then I turned another page. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Sarah had never said anything cruel. Yet somehow a new version of me was forming. A version that needed help. A version that couldn't keep up. A version that preferred other people making decisions. And everyone seemed to believe it, including the grandchildren. A few weeks later, another small humiliation arrived. The kind nobody notices except the person living through it. We were having dinner at Michael's house. My grandson was talking about his college applications. I asked a question. What schools are you most excited about? Before he answered, Sarah spoke. We're focusing on schools closer to home. I waited. My grandson looked at Sarah, then at me, then back at Sarah. The conversation continued. Nobody realized I hadn't received an answer. Nobody realized someone else had answered in my place. Again. I suddenly remembered the waiter, the coffee, the doctor, the weather warning, the church luncheon. One moment alone meant nothing. Together, they felt different, like pieces of the same picture. The pattern interrupt came 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. It happened completely by accident. I stopped by Michael's house on a Wednesday afternoon. Nobody expected me. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside. I heard voices coming from the dining room. Michael, Sarah, my granddaughter. They were discussing holiday plans. At first I smiled. Then I stopped. Spread across the table were papers, schedules, guest lists, seating arrangements, travel plans. Everything looked finished, not started, finished. I stood quietly near the hallway. Then I heard Michael say something that made my stomach tighten. Mom will probably push back at first. Sarah nodded. I know. My granddaughter looked concerned. What if Grandma gets upset? Michael answered calmly. She'll understand once we explain it. Once we explain it, not once we ask, not once we discuss it, once we explain it, I remained completely still. Nobody sounded cruel. Nobody sounded manipulative. Nobody sounded selfish. They sounded organized, reasonable, practical. That was what frightened me. The conversation continued. Sarah pointed at one of the papers. "What about the house?" Michael looked down. "We should probably wait until after Thanksgiving." "The house? My house?" I felt my chest tighten. My granddaughter looked confused. "What house?" Michael answered carefully. "Grandma's." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Sarah spoke. "One thing at a time." I didn't hear much after that, because a single realization kept repeating in my head. They weren't discussing Thanksgiving anymore, they were discussing me. Not with me, about me. I quietly stepped back outside. Nobody knew I had been there. Nobody knew what I had heard. I sat in my car for several minutes, looking through the windshield, trying to understand why this felt so different. Then it hit me. For months, the family had been organizing events, schedules, traditions, appointments. Now they were beginning to organize my future. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I was still part of the conversation or simply the subject of it. 3 days later, Michael called and asked if the whole family could come over Sunday afternoon. He said they wanted to talk about something important. And somehow, before he even finished the sentence, I already knew what it was about. 3 days later, Michael called and asked if the whole family could come over Sunday afternoon. He said they wanted to talk about something important. And somehow, before he even finished the sentence, I already knew what it was about. Sunday arrived faster than I expected. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, straightened the living room. Then I sat by the front window and waited. At 2 o'clock, Michael's SUV pulled into the driveway. Sarah got out first. The grandchildren followed. Everyone looked normal, relaxed, comfortable. That made it harder. People preparing to hurt you usually look nervous. My family looked like they were coming for lunch. We sat around the dining room table, the same table that had hosted birthdays, Christmas dinners, report cards, college announcements, 30 years of family memories. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been talking." There it was. The sentence I had been hearing for months. Not, "What do you think?" Not, "We wanted your opinion." Just, "We've been talking." Sarah opened a folder. Immediately my stomach tightened. I was starting to hate folders. Inside were brochures, maps, information packets, photographs. Michael slid one toward me. "It's a senior community, about 15 minutes from us." I looked at the picture. Small houses, walking paths, community activities, neatly trimmed lawns. Everything looked pleasant. Everything looked organized. Everything looked like a place someone else had chosen. Sarah spoke gently. "We just thought you might like to see some options." Options. Another word that sounded harmless, until you realized the conversation had already moved beyond whether you wanted options at all. I looked at Michael. When did this start? He exchanged a glance with Sarah. "A few months ago." A few months. While I was hearing about Thanksgiving, while I was hearing about doctor's appointments, While I was hearing about driving at night, this conversation had already been happening without me. My granddaughter leaned forward. We'd get to see you more. I smiled at her because she meant it. She wasn't trying to convince me. She genuinely liked the idea. That somehow hurt more. Michael pointed to another brochure. They have transportation. Sarah nodded. Activities, too. Then Michael added, and you wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore. The house. I looked around the room, my walls, my memories. My husband's chair still sat near the window. His books were still on the shelf. His coffee mug was still in the cabinet. I had lived in that house for 43 years, and everyone at the table was discussing it as if it were a practical problem waiting for a practical solution. Nobody was cruel. Nobody was disrespectful. Nobody raised their voice. The conversation stayed calm, reasonable, logical. That was exactly why it felt so overwhelming. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. Did anyone think to ask what I wanted? The room went quiet. Not defensive, just quiet. Michael looked down. Sarah folded her hands together. For a moment, nobody answered. Then Michael spoke. We thought we knew. That sentence landed harder than anything else, not because it was mean, because it was honest. They thought they knew. Somewhere along the way, asking became unnecessary. Deciding became easier. Explaining became easier. Managing became easier. My granddaughter reached across the table and touched my hand. We just worry about you. I squeezed her fingers. I know, and I did know. That was the terrible part. I knew they loved me. I knew they cared. I knew every suggestion came from concern. Yet concern had slowly become authority. And authority had quietly moved from me to them. The conversation lasted another hour. Nobody pressured me. Nobody forced a decision. Eventually, the brochures disappeared back into the folder. The family moved on to lighter topics. School, work, holiday plans, life. Then they left. One by one, the house became quiet again. I stood in the kitchen after the door closed, listening to the silence. For years, I had believed the hardest part of growing older would be needing help. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing help could arrive before you asked for it, before you wanted it, before you were ready. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention, not to what my family said, to what they assumed. Michael assumed he should handle certain decisions. Sarah assumed she should organize certain parts of my life. The grandchildren assumed Sarah would know the answers. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had voted on it. Nobody had announced it. The shift had happened gradually, so gradually that none of us noticed, including me. Thanksgiving arrived. For the first time in decades, it wasn't at my house. I walked into Sarah's dining room carrying a pie. The room was beautiful. The table was full. Everyone seemed happy. Children laughed. People talked. The food smelled wonderful. The family was together. Everything I had spent years trying to create was still there, just not centered around me anymore. Halfway through dinner, I looked around the room. Sarah was organizing serving dishes. Michael was helping guests. The grandchildren were moving comfortably through the house. Nobody needed instructions. Nobody needed reminders. Nobody needed me to coordinate anything. The family functioned perfectly well. That realization hurt, not because I wanted control, because for so long, usefulness had felt like belonging. If they no longer needed me to hold everything together, then who was I now? Later that evening, I stepped onto the back porch. The noise from inside became distant. Cold air filled my lungs. A few minutes later, Michael joined me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he said, "Are you mad at us?" I looked out into the darkness. No. He seemed relieved. Then I added, "I think I'm just trying to understand something." "What?" I took a long breath. For most of my life, people came to me when they needed something. Michael waited quietly. I continued. And now everyone is trying to make sure I don't need anything. Neither of us spoke after that, because there wasn't really anything else to say. That was the change. That was the entire change. Not love, not family, not belonging, just role. My role had changed, and I hadn't noticed until it was almost gone. A few days later, I put the brochures in a drawer. Not because I agreed with them, not because I rejected them, because I wasn't ready. And for the first time in months, I made a decision without discussing it with anyone. It was a small decision, but it was mine. The wound didn't disappear. The sadness didn't disappear. The realization didn't disappear. I still noticed when people answered for me. I still noticed when plans were made without me. I still noticed when someone said, "We'll handle it." Maybe I always would. But at least now I understood what had been happening. Nobody had pushed me out. Nobody had replaced me. Life had simply rearranged itself around a new center. And one day I looked up and realized I was no longer standing in the middle of it. The quote that stays with me is simple. They never stopped loving me. They just stopped needing me the same way. If this story touched you, and you've ever felt a quiet shift inside your own family, please like and subscribe. You may be surprised how many people understand exactly what that feels like.